Hello, Something Guys and Gals. This is Something Guy 912. In my video, The Advent of Two Internet Goliaths Fighting Over David, I mentioned briefly how with the YouTube apocalypse in full swing, that Patreon had a viable purpose in terms of funding a YouTuber's career if the platform drops the ball, like it has so many times before. I want to delve into specifically why, despite my praise of Patreon for that reason, why the system of Patreon is flawed. Now, granted, the website itself is not broken. It does exactly as it is supposed to. It's the kind of people who use it who have tainted the name as a cheap handout. One thing that is inherently wrong with people donating to others via Patreon to meet Patreon goals that the patron themselves can set to give something back to the people who donated, is follow-through. What do I mean by this? Follow-through is meeting the demand that people give you, like, for example, creating a movie, which Spoonie didn't do when he met the Patreon goal of roughly $60,000. As a result of this lack of follow-through, people didn't donate to meet any of his other goals, because not meeting one set a precedent where no one expected him to do so. Now his Patreon is at a paltry $700 a month, and to give you perspective, DSP Gaming has $1,000 a month on his Patreon, because at least he meets his promises, despite what you might think of him. More so than that, Spoonie got extremely defensive about people posting criticisms about meeting his Patreon goals, knowing that he dropped the ball and collectively scammed people full of money. Now granted, I don't think that was the intention of Spoonie, but what I can definitely tell from that goal was someone who thought making movies would be significantly easier than what it came to. Another example of this on the much more sultry side of the internet is pornography, specifically the duo Kavier/Jason Effects, who not only demand roughly $100 per comic, but demand more money for the following pages, and trust me, I have videos planned that will go into that little sinkhole of the internet in the future. Their adamant demand for such money has created a dry swell of infrequent comic book pages, some being posted twice within one day, and another taking over a month long to do so, despite the earnings they have made per HD render/comic page. The second problem with Patreon is specifically the goals themselves. Whether the demand is fair but the output warranted is overwhelming, or the demand is egregious and the output is paltry. People within Patreon do not have realistic goals as to how much money they need compared to exactly how much value the output is. Game Society pimps, as much as I love their content, they have some ridiculous ass demands. $2,800 a month to create another episode of 7 Days to Die live action? Honestly, how exactly does it take an extra $700 a month to film about 30 to roughly 2 hours of two neckbeards conversing about fucking blueberry pie? Not to say that I wouldn't watch it, but the goal is not relative to the output gained. And I know that it doesn't warrant it because in their own Patreon list, they say they have already made the episode, but would promise a equivalent goal as a result. It's a bit dishonest to say the least. Conversely, the Drunken Peasants has a Patreon goal of about 20k, and while that may seem ridiculous, those scammer pieces of shit want to do an RV trip across the country. Now, imagine how much it would cost to afford an RV for one thing, combined with all the technical supplies warranted, as well as technical difficulties with frequent losses of Wi-Fi crossing huge mountain passes or deep forests, and I'd say that 20k is too small considering the heartache that would follow. With not meeting Patreon goals in mind, we delve into the third problem. A lot of the patrons who set up these Patreon goals are basically putting their own content hostage. They'll have the content and the output that they could have, but until that arbitrary donation meter gets to that certain point, they will withhold something that would otherwise give them more exposure in the long run. I already mentioned Kavier/Jason Effects before, but did you also realize that they have already made the entire comic they recently made? E621 wouldn't know, because they have personally demanded content being pulled for at least 2 weeks, roughly around the time when any criticism levied at them would be moot on their alternate forums such as Fur Affinity, for example. So while the Patreon has completed their most recent comic, E621 is still about 8 pages behind on the curve, and will be for roughly another 4 more months. Another point that I want to bring up about Game Society Pimps was that they had posted an episode of 7 Days to Die gameplay that was in an older version of the game after they had gone the arbitrary donation limit to post it in a newer version. So either they had deliberately repressed their own update of the game in order to meet their terms, or more cunningly, had the episode of the play already recorded and waited until said donation limit was met. I wouldn't be surprised if most of these Patreons have mountains of content hid behind what is basically the YouTuber's paywall, similar to how a lot of original content for video games is cut specifically for the purpose to suck out the wallets of the most opportunistic customers. This ultimately comes down to the problem that results from these three issues: lost priorities. There isn't an incentive to make the content that your Patreons give you, or make it good, or make it within a set limit, or to just make content on the fly regardless of Patreon monies, as long as you got the Benjamins to prove it. There isn't any form of quality control from Patreons or any means to make those accountable for the goals they post, so it opens up a lot of holes for people to exploit their consumer base if the time calls for it, such as implying good content without specifying it, a la god-awful movies, using the monies for different purposes not specific to the goal itself, such as with Angry Joe's Super Gaming PC roughly after e-baking for sympathy from YouTube's demonetization wave. In the most absurd case, Rebecca Watson claiming that donating to her will result in 2 videos a week, when all she does is feminist vlogs and stupid atheism plus streams. Despite some of my disagreements with this particular YouTuber, Harmful Opinions has a Patreon that isn't disingenuous, nor makes false promises that the money that you give to him will result in overall better content. He has no Patreon goals, and he specifically says that if you support what I do, donate to my livelihood. This will not go to future videos. He doesn't imply that he won't exist without it, and will continue to make videos on the frequent whether or not the Patreon goals swing. That's a philosophy I can abide, especially considering how strong on YouTube has become with ad monetization, which is perhaps the only way that I can recommend Patreon as an alternate source of revenue, since YouTube doesn't want to support the creators who make their website worth all of the grief it gives. So I end this short video with a suggestion. If you want to make a Patreon the same vein as setting up Patreon goals and the like, I won't stop you, and I can understand if you need to with the adpocalypse continuing to bomb once popular YouTubers into obscurity. Just make sure that your goals are realistic, your output matches the demand, and always give respect to those who are willing to give you $1 when they swing your way. If it's not to your liking, if you can't meet the demand, then only use your Patreon to give people a means to support you without any promise of future or better content from it.